First of all, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedules to be with us this morning. You can probably also guess that my opening remarks will be mercifully brief and unfortunately very, very hoarse. So I'll try to use what little voice I have left to get us through to John King. Before we do get started, I do just want to say a few words with what few words I have remaining about why we have chosen to put this event on. This is our fourth leadership forum here at Social Enterprise, and what we hope to accomplish with today's discussion. The goal of the Social Enterprise program at Columbia is to advance our understanding of how management and business practice can contribute to society. And being located at a university, it's natural that we focus on the creation and exchange of new ideas and innovations. And this forum, which is our fourth, but also the second one that's focused on education, it really exemplifies the way that we try to support innovation and social enterprise. Now, if you've looked through the list of people who are in the room, you should have a sense that we have a very diverse set of education-oriented leaders from the New York City community. And our hope in bringing together this varied mix of people is that you should all walk out of here with some new ways of thinking about the world, and also some new connections to people that you wouldn't normally run into in your day-to-day lives. Now, I promised to keep things brief, so I do now just want to briefly introduce Dr. John King. I should say it is an immense honor and privilege to introduce him. He's really someone who has affected my thinking on the topic of education very, very deeply. He spoke at the last forum that we held on education 3 years ago. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that his comments were an epiphany to me. There are various things that really stuck with me to this day. And I think at least one of them bears repeating, since it essentially framed the topic for today's discussion. And that was in response to an oft-repeated comment that we need to get rid of low-performing teachers early in their careers because they're hopeless and we just need to move on, something like that. I know I'm caricaturing the comment. He said, that's just not going to work in a lot of communities where the teachers are who they are. You go to upstate New York, you don't have applicants lining up around the block to fill open teaching positions. So what we really need to do is think about how we can take a given set of teachers and help them to perform better in the classroom, make them more effective teachers. Now, this will sound to you, once you've heard it, like a completely obvious point. Of course, there are many complications underlying this very simple statement once you think about putting it into practice. And it's also a message that I feel like gets lost very often in the back and forth on some of the more, if I can put it this way, incendiary aspects of the discussion around education reform. And it's what we've chosen to focus on this morning. So it's, again, an immense pleasure and honor to introduce John King, New York State Commissioner of Education, to get us started on this.
Good morning. Wow, that was painful. I'm used to people being a little quiet, but that was painful. Good morning. So it is a pleasure to be with you all and to be back in this forum. Thank you, Ray, for the introduction. So really, Ray's framing is exactly right and really will be the focus of my comments this morning, which I will try to keep relatively brief so that we have lots of time for Q&A. But I really do believe that our task, whether it's at the state education department or at the district level, is to figure out how we better support our educators to ensure better outcomes for our students. And our reform agenda, the work that we're doing at the department, the work that the Regents have undertaken, is directed towards precisely that goal. And so I hope this morning to try to frame what we're working on to make sure that we have a common language. There are some folks in this room who are education policy forum regulars, So they will have to forgive any redundance in my presentation. There are others who are new to the conversation, and I look forward to hearing your perspectives. So let me start with a few simple points about how our world has changed over the last few decades. What is very clear is that the economy of the United States and of New York in particular is very different today from the economy even of 30 or 40 years ago. Students need a post-secondary education to have a shot at opportunity. Now, that may not be a 4-year degree, it may be a 2-year degree, or it may be post-secondary career training. But if you don't have a post-secondary credential, your shot in this economy is incredibly narrow. Your chances of finding a job with a family-sustaining wage that provides decent benefits and that will give you the opportunity to advance in your career, your chances are very, very slim without post-secondary training. And what worries me deeply, and what led the Regents to launch an aggressive reform agenda 4 years ago in 2009, is that we're not doing enough to ensure that our students who leave our high schools actually graduate college and career ready. Indeed, what the numbers here show are a few troubling statistics. One, we graduate about 74% of our students. That means a quarter of our students after 4 years don't even have a high school diploma. And we know what the chances are for a young person without a high school diploma. But even among those who do have a diploma, many of them graduate underprepared for college and careers. We estimate that about 35% of the students who start 9th grade graduate 4 years later with the math and literacy skills necessary to enroll in a credit-bearing college course. 35%. And the achievement gaps are staggering. About 85% of our white students graduate from high school after 4 years, but only 58% of our African American students. And when one looks at college and career readiness, look at that number on the right. African American students, 11.5% of the students who start 9th grade graduate 4 years later with the skills they need to successfully enroll in a credit-bearing college course. And some people might say, well, those are just high school data points. Do we really know that that's right? Do we know that that plays out in post-secondary life? And indeed we do. Today in our 2-year colleges across New York State, a majority of entering students are required to take remedial courses. A majority. And I often try to remind folks that remediation is a euphemism. Remediation means you're in a high school class. You are a college student. You are in a high school class for which you are paying college prices. In our highest needs communities, those numbers are much, much higher. CUNY, between 75 and 80% of entering students in their 2-year community colleges are in remedial classes. We are not doing enough to ensure that our students are college and career ready. Unless you believe this is merely a problem of poverty. It is not. It is a problem of our system as a whole, and as a whole, we are not, as a country, positioning enough of our students to compete in the 21st century economy. There was a recent Wall Street Journal piece that talked about a comparison of the performance of the children of college-educated adults comparing families in Shanghai, Canada, and the United States, and found an achievement gap even there between the United States and our international competitors. I was with Matt Goldstein last night, the chancellor of CUNY, and he talked about this as a national security problem. Our nation's prosperity is at risk if we do not prepare young people to be more competitive. So our students in high needs communities underperform our students in suburban communities. Our students in suburban communities outperform our international competitors, and it comes at a cost. A Stanford University study suggested that there is a $1 trillion annual loss to the economy based on comparing our math performance to the math performance of Canada. If we could raise our math performance just to the level of Canada, we would add $1 trillion a year to our economy, close the fiscal cliff. And for New York, to bring it home, CEOs for cities did a study that Nancy Zimfer, the chancellor at SUNY, often cites that suggested if you added a single percentage point to the college attainment of adults in New York State, you would add $17.5 billion to our economy. So when folks around the state talk about the fiscal crisis facing our school districts and our municipalities and state government, the answer is in the college and career readiness of our young people. If we can grow our economy through the college and career readiness of our young people, graduating young people who can truly compete for 21st century jobs, if we can grow our economy, we can solve our long-term fiscal problems and protect our prosperity. But if we don't do that, what we will see is continued declines in enrollment across our school districts, a ever worsening fiscal picture for our state and our country. It is that simple. So the Regents' reform agenda, our vision, is that we have lots of challenges in society, and no one would argue that just changing what happens in school solves all the challenges we face in our society. Undoubtedly, students face very significant challenges outside of the classroom, particularly our highest need students. But as educators, we have a responsibility to ensure that the system we lead is as effective as possible. And so the Regents laid out a vision 4 years ago of how we would tackle that, starting with ensuring that the standards that we teach, the instruction that we deliver, reflects a trajectory to college and career readiness. So we joined with 45 other states in adopting the Common Core standards, a set of standards mapped backwards from college and career success, by asking higher education faculty and business leaders, what are the skills students need to be successful? And given that, what must they know and be able to do at 10th grade, at 7th grade, at 3rd grade, all the way back to kindergarten? And we in New York added a pre-K foundation for the Common Core because we understand there's a set of academic skills and social skills and learning skills that students need to acquire in early childhood education so they are prepared to succeed in our K-12 system. We committed to build instructional data systems to better support principals and teachers in leveraging student performance data to inform instruction, not merely to sort, but to differentiate instruction, to figure out how we help all of our students to be successful. We committed to do work, which I'll focus most of my comments on ensuring that we prepare, support, evaluate, train, develop the best possible workforce of teachers and principals. And we committed to focus intently on our lowest performing schools. As troubling as those statistics are, we have schools in this state and in this city where less than half of the students who start in the 9th grade graduate from high school 4 years later. Schools that actually organize their school day on the assumption that kids won't be back after 9th grade, with a 9th grade schedule and a schedule for everyone else. And so that is a morally urgent challenge for our state and country, and we are very focused on improving performance in those schools. So why standards? Why the Common Core? Why focus so much on a set of standards? Aren't standards just something that goes in a binder on a shelf in the back of a teacher's classroom? Not these standards, not if we do it right. The Common Core requires us to think differently about instruction in ways that align with college and career readiness. We know, for example, that when students take college placement exams, those are asked to demonstrate their literacy skills, virtually all of the texts they're asked to read are nonfiction texts. Why? Because those are the kinds of texts they'll read in psychology class or history class or biology class or in a technical job. And yet we have de-emphasized students' ability to read nonfiction texts in our K-12 system. And so the Common Core calls for us to challenge students to read a balance of fiction and nonfiction texts so that they are prepared to read the kind of text they will confront in college and careers. My 6-year-old the other day said to me, "Why is it that mommy fixes everything?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, if anything breaks, she fixes it." So I am no expert on the technical trades, but I will say I was in the North Country a few months ago in a classroom where students were learning to be electricians. And students were working on, those things that are inside the boxes with wires. And sitting on one of the desks was the National Electrical Code, the Bible of electricians. I encourage you to pick up the National Electrical Code. You will find that the text is written at a level of complexity that significantly exceeds most of the texts we ask of our high school students. And so this work on nonfiction texts, on text complexity, isn't just about preparing students for the most rigorous liberal arts college. It is about preparing students for college and career success. The Common Core focuses on the kind of writing that students need to do in college and careers. That is writing that relies on evidence drawn from other texts. The Common Core asks us to ensure that students develop the kind of academic vocabulary that allows them to access, whether it's the text in a college course or just to read a story in the New York Times and be able to discern fact from fiction. Right? Those skills that the Common Core requires are the skills students need for college and career success and ought to be what drives our instruction. I was in a classroom in Western New York a few months ago. One of the things that the Common Core calls on us to do is to have evidence-based conversation about text, to look deeply into what the author is arguing in the text. I was in a classroom in Western New York where students were reading Esperanza Rising. It's a text that is in the curriculum that we're building in New York State around the Common Core, fifth grade text. So I was sitting with a group of fifth graders. They were reading Esperanza Rising and looking in that text for evidence of the themes in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so they were working through the text, and I said to one of the students, how's English instruction this year different with the Common Core than last year? And the student said, well, last year we did book reports. So we read the book, we get to the end, and we write a book report about it. This year, we have to use evidence from the text to support our ideas. Perfect. I wished I had a video camera. Then the next student said, yeah, and to do that, you have to read every page really closely, which was fantastic. And I really wished I had a video camera. But the best was the third student who said, yeah, and the books are better that way. Right? And isn't that true? Right? That a book is better when you closely read the text and you engage in a conversation and dialogue with the author. And so that's what the Common Core is about. That's why it's worth investing in. That's why we believe it can be a game changer in New York education. In mathematics, the Common Core calls for us to focus on those concepts that are most critical for later success in mathematics. To move away from the inch deep, mile wide, to actually ensuring that students master the concepts that are critical for later success. For example, the authors of the Common Core often will cite the fact that the United States leads the world in patterns. If you ask students in the United States pattern questions, they get them right more often than other countries. Unfortunately, we trail in fractions, and it turns out that fractions matter a lot more for later success in mathematics than patterns. And so the authors of the Common Core argue, and we believe, that we should focus our attention on those skills that we know will be highest leverage. And again, this is not just about preparing students for the four-year college. I was in the southern tier near the Pennsylvania border in a welding classroom. And I was taking a tour of the classroom. The welding teacher said to me, this is the section of the classroom for the students who are good at fractions, and this is the section of the classroom for the students who are bad at fractions. Because to do fine welding, you need to be able to think in fractions. And so the students who are best prepared to get good jobs as welders are the students who have good command of fractions. So again, it is not about ensuring that every student is ready to come to Columbia, although that would be great. It is about ensuring that every student is ready for college and career success. Our work in mathematics also focuses us on problem solving and students' ability to apply their math knowledge to real-world situations. One of the authors of the Common Core often makes the point that when you go to the bank and you sit with the banker doesn't say, hey, before you sign this, you may want to set up a percent problem to figure out if I'm going to fleece you or not. Right? The banker doesn't say that. Math doesn't come to us that way. It doesn't come in preset problems where we just plug the numbers into a formula. Math comes to us in real-world applications, in the bank loan, in the New York Times article, in the bar graph. And we've got to then use our math to solve those problems. And even more true in those careers that depend on success in the STEM fields. And so the work on the Common Core in mathematics focuses us on problem solving, and we are changing both how we teach and how we assess. You may have read about the way that the assessments changed this year in New York. They were more challenging, but more challenging because they reflect these very skills that the Common Core requires. The reality is people do what is measured. and we must measure what we value. And if these are the skills we value, then that is what we need to set out as our standards. It is how we must organize our instruction, and it is ultimately what we must assess. And we have tried to provide the department significant support for educators. We launched a professional development website, engageny.org, that now is approaching 17 million page views. It has become a go-to resource across the country for curricular materials, professional development tools. On there is a video series on the Common Core that we developed with the Common Core authors and PBS. We are building out a library of videos of effective instruction that reflects the Common Core that will sit on Engage New York. We are trying to provide the resources so that teachers are not working to implement the Common Core in isolation. We are building, to my knowledge, the only state curriculum to reflect the Common Core. It is a resource for districts. Curriculum is ultimately a district responsibility, but we believe that there is a powerful role the state can play in putting forward examples of excellence in instruction. And so we are building out a full pre-K through 12 curriculum in mathematics and English language arts. There are lots of those curriculum modules already on Engage New York and more added each month. We are working with the authors of the Common Core to ensure that those materials truly reflect the core and the level of rigor that the core requires. And I have the privilege, as I spend a lot of time visiting schools and districts, to walk into classrooms where those Common Core modules that we're building are being used by teachers in their instruction and also shaping their own work to develop their own lesson plans and units. This is an important statement that we're making about the value of curriculum, the importance of the texts that we choose, the importance of the problems we ask students to undertake, because we know that instruction matters. We are also, as I mentioned, focused on this idea of data-driven instruction, and unfortunately people often minimize data-driven instruction to the sort of post-mortem analysis of last year's results. How did students do last year on the state test? The students I don't teach anymore. But that's not what we mean by data-driven instruction. What we mean by data-driven instruction is looking at student work in November and February and asking, where are students struggling? How do I need to change my instruction to ensure that students meet the standards? And we are, of course, focused on teacher and principal evaluation. All but one district in New York State is now all but one district, one very large district. All but one district reached agreements with their bargaining units around new evaluation systems for teachers and principals, and are engaged in the difficult but important work of implementing those evaluation systems. And a month from now, New York City will finally have a new evaluation system for teachers and principals. And so every district in the state will then be engaged in this important work. And we know it matters. I see Jonah Rockoff in the back. I cite him all the time, as did the President of the United States in the State of the Union. It is clear from Jonah's work and others' work that teachers matter significantly, that students who have a series of highly effective teachers will do better, and students who have a series of ineffective teachers will do worse. In a sense, this is, to all of us, if we think back to our own educational experiences, to some degree self-evident. We know teachers matter. We've all sat in classrooms where we wondered, what is the point of being in this room? And we've all sat in classrooms where we've been challenged and we could feel ourselves sweating intellectually as we tried to grapple with the work that was in front of us. And the research that Jonah has done, the research that Tom Kane will describe, that research supports exactly the work that we are engaged in New York, the work to ensure that our teachers are as effective as possible so that students have access to those opportunities. We also know that for our highest need students, those effective teachers matter even more. And we know that our ability to close the achievement gap is inseparable from the work of improving our teacher and principal practice. We also know that historically, teacher evaluation and principal evaluation has not been done well in this country and has been done in a way that is, in a sense, irrelevant to instructional change. If you say 99.9% of people are satisfactory and 0.1% are unsatisfactory, that is not a performance management system. And so we are building a performance management system that differentiates performance, that tries to identify those who are highly effective so that they can be models for their colleagues, identifies those who are struggling so they can get support, and provides everyone with continuous feedback so that they can improve their performance. And when you survey, and this is from the widget effect study by TNTP, when you survey teachers and principals, they know it. When I was a teacher, I knew that there were colleagues who were not as effective as others. And so educators understand that performance is differentiated, but we've got to build a system that helps people actually get better. Tom will talk about his research. It's always a risk in trying to summarize in a slide the research of someone who's about to present, who is far more expert on the subject. But I will try and at least saying that there are important lessons from Tom's work, which I'm sure he will describe, for what good evaluation systems must achieve. I look forward to his feedback on my slide. But what we know is that multiple measures matter, that we learn more from multiple measures than from a single measure. We know that value-added measures, measures of growth in student learning, can be a very useful tool as part of an evaluation system. We know that observations can be powerful and can be strengthened by having multiple observations and multiple observers. So there are things we know, and the question is, what do we do with that knowledge, and how does that knowledge inform our work to implement new evaluation systems? We also know that there is emerging evidence of evaluation systems changing practice. There was a study done in Cincinnati that showed that where mid-career teachers received full evaluations and got feedback, their students' performance improved, and that performance improvement was sustained. That is a good sign about the potential for evaluations alongside the work on the Common Core, integrated with the work on the Common Core, to change practice and improve outcomes. And we know we can't just focus on teachers, we must also focus on principals. Arnie Duncan often will say, he has never been to a good school without a good principal. Principal leadership matters, it matters significantly, and it matters for teacher quality. Right? Good teachers want to work for a good principal. Struggling teachers get better when supported by a good principal. And so the principal evaluation system, although it gets less attention than the teacher evaluation work, is critically important to the success of our reform efforts. And it means we have to ask our principals to do different things. This work that we're doing on teacher and principal evaluation will require a change in the role of principal. I was in a school in a suburban district in the capital region, and I asked the principal, I often ask principals when I'm touring their school, what this year are you most excited about and what are you most nervous about? And the principal said, well, the same, evaluation. And I said, well, why is that? And she said, well, I'm nervous about the change in culture that we need to undergo as a school, and I'm nervous about my ability to give good feedback to every teacher, and I'm nervous about the time that needs to go into observing. And I said, and what are you excited about? And she said, well, I'm excited to see some of my teachers teach. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, we used to have a rule that we have limits on whether or not you could actually observe instruction and provide feedback to teachers who were tenured. And now, because of the evaluation system, I'm going to get into those teachers' classrooms, actually get to see them teach, and be able to give them feedback. And so that's how far we were from a performance management system and the opportunity that we have. Now, in New York, our evaluation system, just to give a high level, requires annual evaluations with regular feedback. It requires, as one factor of the evaluation system, student learning measures. It requires multiple observations of teachers by administrators. It differentiates performance into 4 categories: highly effective, effective, developing, and ineffective. And the law requires that those evaluations be a significant factor in employment decisions. And we tried to build the law around what we know works in teacher evaluation. When we look at growth, it is important to emphasize that growth is not about students' absolute performance. It is about how a teacher's students did in comparison to similar students. And when we look at similar students, we look at a variety of demographic factors, including their prior academic history, whether or not it's a student with disabilities, whether or not it's an English language learner, whether or not it's a student in poverty. So we are comparing teachers to similar students. Some of the anxiety, I think, about the new work on evaluation comes from confusion about this very point. And teachers will sometimes say to me, well, my students are students in poverty. My students, I have a lot of English language learners in my classroom. How can I be compared to the teacher in Scarsdale whose students have none of those challenges? And what I often try to remind them is that is not how the system works. The system compares teachers of similar students to each other. And then we try to identify who is excelling and who is struggling. Last year, when we generated growth scores, this is the distribution that we had for teachers and principals, teachers on the left, principals on the right. And we expect a fairly similar distribution this year. Sometimes people think, oh, the evaluation system is going to identify huge numbers of teachers as ineffective. That's not the idea. The idea is to try to make good judgments about who's most effective and who's struggling so that people can get the support they need. And that was our rough distribution. There was a New York Times piece recently about the way in which evaluation systems across the country are unfortunately replicating the old system. So lots of new systems, but then the same outcome of 98%, 2%, 99%, 1%. That is not acceptable. We have good evidence from our work last year that we can avoid that in New York, and we intend to. The system only makes sense if we can actually use it to try and improve performance. Oftentimes people will say, but what about all the teachers who teach students who aren't in tested grades? And that matters immensely. I hope Tom will speak to this as well. Only about 20% of teachers in New York State are in grades 4 through 8 and have English language arts and math test scores to use for generating growth scores. That's a lot of teachers for whom we want to look at how their students are doing, for whom we do not have state test scores. And so we, like many states, are using a process called student learning objectives, which very simply is asking, what is it this course is intended to achieve, and how will we know if we achieved it? And one of the things that's sometimes shocking about this work on evaluation is, how were we not asking that question before? When I talk to a science teacher or a social studies teacher, and they'll say, oh, the student learning objectives, it's so hard to figure it out. And I'll say, well, just think of it this way. On the first day of September, what do you hope to achieve by the end of the school year? And how did you intend to measure that, to know if you achieved it? That's the right work to be doing in schools, not just because of the evaluation system, but because fundamentally every course should be constructed that way. We also have in New York not only the state growth measure, but a locally selected measure that is bargained between bargaining units and their districts. That is an opportunity to supplement the state measures. So sometimes people will say, well, the state, even though the new Common Core assessments do have more problem solving and more writing, it's not enough. We need more essays, we need more performance tasks. Fantastic. That's what the locally selected measures can be. And there's an opportunity for districts and bargaining units to use the Common Core to figure out how do we supplement our knowledge about student learning. A couple final points on evaluation. The rubrics that are used for evaluation line up with the Common Core. Recently, there have been people who have been saying, well, we should do the Common Core first. And then, later, much later, we should get to evaluations. That is irrational. The work on the Common Core and the work on evaluations are intimately connected. The principal in the classroom who's observing the teacher, what should they be observing for? The very practices that the Common Core calls for. The principal in the classroom should be looking for, is the teacher asking evidence-based questions around text? Is the text that students are reading meaningful and challenging and a rich text worth reading? Is the teacher differentiating instruction to help students not only memorize a mathematical formula, but actually understand how that math concept applies in the real world? And so we've tried to help districts understand how you leverage the observation work to support the success of the Common Core. The Common Core authors have also developed, which we have on Engage New York, evidence collection tools, quick observation tools to allow a principal to walk through the school and try to identify good instructional practice that reflects the Common Core. Now, Norman will talk later about teacher preparation. And again, people will say to us, oh, you're doing so many things all at once. You should do them in sequence. I had someone say to me, you know, what we should do is we should start the Common Core with kindergartners. And then we should just phase it in over the next, 13 years. And then we'll really be ready. And then we could do evaluation. And then later we can change teacher and principal preparation. Again, the students don't have the time to wait. The students are accountable for the Common Core today. When they take that placement test in college and they're sent to a remedial course, they're accountable for the Common Core. Sadly, when students don't persist from first year to second year of college, because of all those remedial courses they had to take, they're accountable for the Common Core. When students can't get a job as a welder because they don't know fractions, they're accountable for the Common Core. Students can't wait, so we can't wait. And so we have to, in an integrated way, try to tackle the work on the Common Core, the work on teacher and principal evaluation, and changing how we prepare our teachers and principals so they are ready to succeed with respect to the Common Core. It means, for example, that our elementary school teachers need to have much greater command of mathematics so that they can teach the math Common Core to their students effectively. And so that means we've got to change how we prepare our teachers. And we've got lots of great tools that we're developing. Tom and Norman will both talk about video and the way in which video as a tool is transforming how we evaluate teachers and also how we support teachers in their pre-service preparation. We are changing all of our certification assessments to reflect the Common Core and to reflect the kinds of practices that will ensure students succeed against the Common Core. And as part of that, we are one of many states that have adopted what's called the EdTPA, a new portfolio-based assessment for teacher preparation candidates that requires them to videotape their practice, to reflect on that practice. That makes our certification process not just about a set of paper and pencil measures, but about can you do the things you need to do in the classroom to help your students succeed. So we're doing a lot of different things to try to make instruction better. And for me, as a teacher and a principal, what I always tried to emphasize was, how do we make sure that we use those moments in the classroom to the best effect? And when I was a principal, I'd say to teachers, there are lots of things in kids' lives that we can't control. There are things that are going to happen to them before school, after school, on the weekend, that we can't control. But those moments that they're with us, that they're in the classroom with us, that we can expose them to the world, where we can provide them with the kinds of skills that will allow them to succeed in college and careers, that we can control. And the work of educators is to try to ensure that every student gets the best possible education, to make sure that every student's classroom gets the most rigorous instruction. And so I hope we will talk today, as we talk about the work on evaluation, the work on teacher preparation, the work we're doing, I hope we will all focus on how do we ensure that every kid gets that best moment. Every one of us can think of a teacher who had a transformative effect on our lives. We can think of the assignment or the text that changed our lives. Every kid deserves that. And our job is to make sure we deliver that. So with that, I'd be happy to take your questions. Yes, sir. It's a great question. So, part of what we are trying to change is that if you don't differentiate performance, you have no basis for having employment consequences. We have a number of pilot projects around the state around how you might change compensation systems to reflect some of this work. So how do you ensure that the highly effective teacher becomes a model for his or her colleagues? And how do you reward that success? It is a very challenging topic, I think, particularly for labor, because historically part of the history of the labor movement is the solidarity of the membership. the alikeness of the membership, if you will. And so it is a challenge, I think, culturally, to suggest that we need to differentiate not only performance, but differentiate rewards. We have a number of pilot projects that are going on in districts with the cooperation of their bargaining units. And I think over time, our compensation model will have to change. What is clear is that if we want to have, for example, the strongest possible science and math teachers, we have to think differently about how we attract them to the profession and how we keep them. All of that said, one of the things that is striking about the research on teacher attitudes is that teachers will often put working conditions and the opportunity to improve their practice ahead of compensation when describing what it is that matters to them. And so one of the opportunities we have here is to create a culture that is a much better place to work. And one of the frustrations, I think, for a teacher who's working incredibly hard in her classroom is the teacher in the neighboring classroom who is not working very hard and whose students are not making progress. Or worse still, when that teacher is in the grade before yours and those students come to you and you can see in their lack of skills your colleagues' lack of effectiveness. And so I do believe that even without changing the compensation system, creating a performance management culture in schools will actually lead to better working conditions that make people not only want to become teachers, but stay teachers. And the other thing, one of the pieces of, one of the striking things here, in this widget effect report, TNTP did a survey of teachers, and you see the bolded bullet there. 73% of teachers said their evaluations did not identify any development areas. And of those whose did, 55% did not receive useful feedback on how to improve. Right? That's not a way to keep people who want to be successful. If they feel like they're not getting feedback, they're not getting an opportunity to grow. So part of what we're trying to change is that culture, alongside thinking about the compensation issues.
Yeah. So following up on that, sort of related, which I think the conversation has become a lot about, okay, use this as a tool so you can get bad teachers out, but we know we don't have enough teachers. So what are the policy levers that you think the state can play in that next step, which is, we call it in Connecticut, teacher evaluation and support. So the support pieces to ensure they are getting the feedback to improve their teaching.
So I think that's exactly right, and it goes back to the point that Ray made at the opening. The test of this work will be, do we get better at helping people improve their practice? Right? Three things that we believe are critical. One is principals have to be prepared to give meaningful feedback and to have difficult conversations. And historically, that has not been a part of principal preparation. And so one of the things that we're changing, and Stephanie Wood-Garnett, who's our Assistant Commissioner for Higher Ed, is here with me. One of the things we are working to change is principal preparation. Our certification assessment for new principals starting next year will include watching a videotape of a teacher's instruction and describing the feedback that would be given. And part of why we're changing the certification assessment in that way is to change how principal preparation programs think about their work. So one is the role of principal. Two is we need models of highly effective practice. No matter how struggling the school, you can go to any school and find that there is a classroom where excellent things are happening. And people will say, you walk into a school that's struggling, and they'll say, you got to go to Miss Brown's classroom, because in Miss Brown's classroom, it's a transformative environment and great things are happening. But Miss Brown's practice is not transparent to everyone else. So we've started this videotape project where we are videotaping classrooms where Common Core instruction is happening, and we're going to use put those videos on Engage New York and use that to help principals and teachers think about what good practice looks like. One of my colleagues at Uncommon Schools, Doug Lamab, wrote a book, A Taxonomy of Effective Teaching Practices, Teach Like a Champion. And that book is really about watching great teachers and trying to describe what it is they do. One of my favorite examples is Stretch It. And Doug, the way Doug talks about this idea of Stretch It is that, if you're in the classroom and you ask a question of students and the student gives an answer, oftentimes what a teacher will do is take that answer and then move on to the next student. And Doug suggests, no, what you should do is stretch it. You should ask a follow-up question that pushes that student to think more deeply. And when you think about it in terms of the Common Core, it's that moment where you say, which character which character was responsible for for the cookie jar falling over, and the kid gives you an answer, there's an opportunity to say, well, how do you know? Where did you see that in the text? Where did the author tell you that? Right? And there's an opportunity to stretch their thinking and to push their thinking. And we need to do more of that, and video, I think, can be a powerful tool there. The third piece is that as a part of our law, there's a requirement for an improvement plan for the ineffective teacher or the developing teacher. And one of the tests of this system will be, are districts and bargaining units willing to use that plan, that improvement plan, as a truly a tool for improvement, or is it merely a compliance exercise? To document on the behalf of the district how, an unreasonable set of goals that the teacher can't meet so that they can force them out, or on the part of the bargaining unit to document an unreasonable set of expectations of support that far exceed what any school could reasonably provide so that they can protect the teacher from removal. If both sides approach that improvement plan as a dress rehearsal for a removal hearing, it won't work. But if both sides address that improvement plan as an opportunity to talk realistically about what supports are needed and how the person can improve, that could be a very powerful tool. James.
Given the Buffalo side deal, what optimism should anyone have that people will approach this in the way you just described? And second, you may know we're in a mayoral election here in...
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. So if you were chancellor, what 2 or 3 measures, numerically, quantitatively, would you want to be held accountable for, just like that social studies teacher you want to hold accountable for 4 years from now?
Wow. Yeah. Think for a bit about the second question and try and answer the first. So on Buffalo, what James is referring to is that Buffalo School District and their bargaining unit essentially constructed an alternative evaluation system to the one that they submitted and received approval on, consistent with the law. And what we've made clear to them is, you can't do that. You can't sign a document that says this is our evaluation system when secretly you have constructed an alternative evaluation system. In the simplest form, we do not view that side agreement as valid. We view it as void. But I think what it does reflect is that this work is, the measure of this work will be in the implementation. That is not enough to just pass a law. That we've got to make sure that we enforce the law and that we provide the right supports. At the end of the day, I think our greatest leverage will be in leveraging the bright spots rather than the compliance work with those who are resistant. Because I believe if we have a set of districts in New York that are doing this work well, we have a video on Engage New York about the Webster School District that's outside of Rochester, where they have embraced the work on Common Core and evaluation management and labor, and they are using it to improve it. In a district that already has decent performance, they are using it to drive even better performance for their students. And their voices, I think, are the ones that ultimately need to drive the conversation. So the reason I'm optimistic is that I do believe we are beginning to have those bright spots emerge, and we're going to focus attention there. And ultimately, the Buffalo teachers and principals, I think, will want what Webster has. Will want the kind of learning outcomes for students and the kind of work conditions that are emerging in Webster as a result of this work. So that's my reason for optimism, but it is a fair worry that there will be efforts always to undermine. On the second point, it's difficult to boil down anything to a simple set of metrics, and I will resist the temptation to answer the question exactly as framed. But we'll say that in my role, but I'll try to answer it in my role as commissioner, how I think about what I hope we are accountable for in New York City, irrespective of who the next chancellor is. If 4 years from now we still have the remediation rate for our high school graduates who are entering colleges that we have today, we will have not done our work well enough. It's just that simple. Because those remedial classes translate into students dropping out. And what we know around, not just New York, but around the country is the students drop out, but they've got the debt anyway. Right? And the debt follows them. They don't have the degree, but the debt follows them. And so our ability to ensure that students graduate and graduate college and career ready, and then go on to college and succeed there, those to me are the metrics for which I want to be accountable in New York City and in the rest of the state. So we are watching each year those numbers, trying to figure out how do we move them. Now, can we move them quickly? I worry that in education reform and in education policy, there's this tendency, well, you started the Common Core, is it better yet? Right? And so there is this tendency to say, within 6 months, have we moved the metrics? And I think we've got to have a longer view than that. But I do think 4 years, a mayoral term, a governor's term, is a reasonable indicator of whether or not progress is being made. I think early on, there are process wins. I think the work on the Common Core, changing the assessments to reflect college and career readiness, putting in place the evaluation system are important process wins and steps forward. But ultimately, if students are not graduating at a higher rate and graduating ready for college and careers and then staying in school and finishing, then it won't have mattered.
Oh, maybe I should actually use this.
I realize it's still early days, but I was wondering if there's something that you would pick up on in improving teacher performance where it's just turned out to be a dud. You had high hopes for it, but it just didn't work. Because I think we can learn a lot from these sorts of aspirations that ultimately aren't successful.
It's a great question, and I think a good one to ask of Tom as well. One thing I think districts are struggling with, even in this first year really of full implementation, is managing the time around observations. And there's been a history of saying the only way to do observations, you got to do this hour-long pre-conference about what you're going to see, and then you go and observe for an hour, and then you got to do an hour-long debrief of the observation. Well, if you're a principal in a building with 40 teachers, that starts to add up very quickly. And I think many districts are going to reevaluate whether that's the smartest approach. And I think there's a strong argument to be made that frequent, shorter observations and a culture in which there's the expectation that adults will be in and out of the classroom, and that's one of the things we tried to do at Uncommon. I think many districts are reevaluating those kind of time constraints and looking at are there better ways to build an instructional culture. Another is the assessments matter a lot. And as people chose these locally selected measures, ironically, we hoped they would choose locally selected measures that would complement the state tests, but in many cases they chose what was expedient to comply with the law. And so one of the things that I am encouraging superintendents to do this summer is to look at those locally selected assessments and ask, are they the right ones? Are they going to drive instruction in the right ways? Do they reflect the Common Core? Are they looking for opportunities to ask students to write more, to problem solve more? So I think there are a lot of important lessons even from this first year. And again, the challenge in the political climate, which is very much about good guys and bad guys, is to be able to have a nuanced conversation about what's working and not without people rushing to say, well, this proves that the system is perfect or it proves that it can't work. There's just work to do to make any effort successful.
I want to thank you for Engage New York. For, I think, the teachers in New York City, it was the only source of curriculum they've had. So, I said, gee, I don't know of any other state. Now, no, there was no other state, so thank you for that. It's a wonderful resource. I want to ask about the test. There's still a strong emphasis, New York State is not so bad, but on test scores, standardized for making high-stakes decisions. To what extent, closing schools, student placement, entrance into certain programs, to what extent, if that continues, do you think that will work against instruction in the Common Core and go back to a test prep mentality that we have in so many places now?
It's a great question. I worry a lot about that, and I think the political climate doesn't help because there's this tendency to say if you're willing to consider the test among multiple measures, people reduce your position to you're a test person. And if you say, well, I think we need to have multiple measures and we shouldn't base decisions on tests alone, people say, oh, well, you're an anti-test person. And I actually think what we know is that it should be somewhere in the middle, that there's useful information to be gained from whether or not students are making growth on tests as they are constructed today. And we can make them better. We already are doing that in New York. I think technology gives us the opportunity to make them even better still down the road. They provide us with useful information, but we shouldn't make decisions without multiple measures. Around evaluation, I often use the example, I'm a baseball fan, of batting average. If we're talking about a position player, I want to know their batting average before I make a decision. But batting average isn't the only thing I want to know in order to make a decision. I also want to know how many home runs they hit, can they field at all, are they going to be a good teammate with other players, do they get a lot of walks? I mean, there are a lot of pieces of information I want, but if you said, will you pay this player $20 million a year, but I won't tell you their batting average, I'd be nervous, right? And so I think of it that way. We want this information to be part of a multiple measure system at the individual educator level and at the school level. That said, once we have the information, I do not think we always do a very good job of doing something useful with it. So for the educator, whose students are not making a lot of academic progress, and whose observations results suggest they're struggling, and whose locally selected measures suggest that students are not making progress, that's an educator who needs an intervention and support to get better. And too often, as Deborah mentioned, the evaluation system is thought of as a way to get rid of that person. That is not smart performance management. Smart performance management is let's figure out if we can make this person better and what supports will help them get better. At the school level, the same thing is true. And part of the sort of anti-testing environment that has developed, I think, is because people make a series of pedagogical mistakes in response to the results. So they say, my test scores aren't good, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to crowd out history and science and art and music, and I'm going to reduce instruction to as much rote test prep as I can and hope for better outcomes. It's pedagogically a mistake because actually students do worse, but it also is not what any of us mean by the definition of a good education. And so one of our challenges there is how do you help people see what the path is to better outcomes when they know the outcomes aren't what they want. And unless we have more resources like Engage New York, more curricular resources, the videos of effective instruction, people are going to go to what's easiest and quickest, which seems like test prep. And so a lot of times when parents say, oh, it feels like the testing is all the time, part of what they mean by that is that there's all of these test prep activities that aren't rigorous or engaging or interesting or compelling, and they worry about that. That's a fair worry. And I think the best way to tackle that is the work we're doing on the Common Core, the work we're doing on evaluation, the work we're doing on curriculum, and creating an ecosystem that supports good instruction. Last question.
So thinking about student achievement, have you guys thought about how you're going to take into account schools and teachers that have external support? So students that are receiving extra tutoring after school provided by another organization?
Well, two things. One is because we're comparing similar students, there's a set of advantages that, in terms of state growth, there's a set of advantages that are more likely to correspond to students who are not free and reduced price lunch eligible as opposed to those students who are free and reduced price lunch eligible. But can we construct, and I'm sure Tom will comment on this, can we construct a growth measure that controls for all the possible influences? No, impossible. We can construct a growth measure that controls for lots of things, and then we need a multiple measure system that gives us good information. The example I often give, most states and districts prior to all of this work were relying on a single observation strategy for evaluation, if they were evaluating at all. Principal comes in, sits in the classroom, is there for 42 minutes. Well, imagine for a teacher, teacher has Tom in the class and James in the class, and James troublemaker, And Tom gets all the answers right. He is the person who drives conversation in a good direction. Sitting in the front row, hand raised. So the principal comes in, the teacher's teaching, and it happens that's the day James is absent. So no problem. Tom, every time conversation seems to stall, Tom suggests something that keeps the conversation moving. Principal walks out and says, "Wow, teacher's a superstar." Now, same teacher, different day. Tom's absent. He's participating in the state spelling bee. He can't be there that day. James is there that day, and James is having a bad day. And James is interrupting, and he's talking to his neighbor, and he's throwing spitballs, and the principal walks out and says, "Whew, that class is terrible." Now the sample size, one 42-minute period across 180 days of 5, 6, 7 hours of instruction, the sample size is incredibly small. And so, can you control for that? No, but multiple observations and multiple observers better? Absolutely. Right, so with the growth measure, will you ever be able to control for all of the factors? No. But if you control for prior academic history and free and reduced price lunch eligibility, English language learner status, and students with disability status, and we have a slew of other demographic factors that we're considering adding, if you control for those, you get to a more accurate picture, but not one that you can defend as perfect and the sole basis for a decision. It has to be one of multiple measures that you look at. So it's a very fair question, and it's true for school accountability too. And thinking about as you compare school performance, what are all the factors that are affecting school performance? Again, you can't get to a perfect measure, but with multiple measures, you can get to a better measure. And then ultimately what matters is then what you do with that information. I think I'm getting the hook. So, but thank you all for a great conversation. I look forward to